What you need to know is that this watch right here is possibly the best Explorer alternative out there. It's a watch that combines a straightforward and easy-to-use nature of a field watch with touches of sophisticated refinement to create a true go-anywhere and do-anything powerhouse. Which is why this, the Monta Triumph, is one of my grails. My Microbrand Grail, if you will. Although there is a lot more to it than that. And simply saying that this is an Explorer alternative and leaving it at that does this one a bit of a disservice. Because the Triumph has so much going for it that it really deserves to be known in its own right, and not simply an alternative to something else. And I think by the end of this review, you'll see that as well. And before we jump into this one, I do want to point out that this is my watch. It was one I obsessed over for a while, until I finally took the plunge a few months ago. But I didn't buy it new, I got it secondhand, which I will talk about a little bit later, but the key thing to note here is that it's not in pristine condition, so just be aware of that. As well as the clasp it's using is an older version than the one that currently comes with it. Anyway, let's start off things with the specs. In general, Monta likes to keep things slim and sophisticated, so the Triumph is a 38.5mm wide watch with a lug-to-lug of about 47. Total thickness is a sleek 9.4mm, and that's going from its flat sapphire crystal to its exhibition caseback, which is actually impressive considering this is still a rather capable watch, with 150 meters of water resistance and a signed screw-down crown. I mean, after all, at its heart, it is still a tool watch. It's just a really good-looking tool watch. And on my 7.25-inch wrist, it's just about a perfect fit. At first, I did have some concerns about this really long, skinny clasp, but once it's fit properly, it's perfect on the wrist. It's one where you put it on and it just melts to your wrist. It's perfectly balanced, stays right where it needs to, as well as it's one that has a good solid feel to it. Yet it's still light enough at 130 grams on its bracelet that you can easily forget you're wearing it throughout the day. Which is one of the reasons I recently took it with me on vacation, as it's an extremely comfortable, go anywhere and do anything watch, and in the future might actually wind up replacing my Khaki King as my go-to travel watch. Now, rounding out the specs, it also has a 20mm lug width, a Monta M22 caliber movement, which is really just a Sellita SW300. And while Monta itself is based out of St. Louis, all of their watches are Swiss made, with this Triumph coming in at an MSRP of $1,700. And no, I didn't misspeak. If that shocks you a little bit, you've probably never heard of Monta, as they are one of the more expensive microbrands out there, and their competition is more going to be along the lines of Longines, Oris, and maybe even some of the lower tier luxury level watches than, say, your average Seiko. Now, part of their justification for all of this is the level of fit and finish they put into their watches. It is a cut above, and this is especially true with the case, as here with the Triumph, there are a number of finer details all distinctly defined across it. As this is a field watch, the sidewalls as well as the top of the case have a vertical brushing, while the wider, clean bezel has more of a sunburst pattern to it, framing the dial and making the watch seem just a little bit bigger than it actually is. And each of those elements is also bordered by a fine polished edge, one running the outer edge of the case, the bezel, as well as the sleek chamfer on the inside of the lugs, which just so happens to match up with the polished edge of the bracelet, giving the entire thing a beautifully cohesive feel, creating a subtle yet ultimately engaging design. This isn't one that's going to capture your attention from across the room. It's much more subtle than that, as a field watch should be. But it is one that once you get a good look at it, it will captivate you. It's a design that at its heart is a bit tooly, yet it's one with sophisticated touches of refinement to highlight its overall sleek profile. With the only thing that I think it's missing is maybe a scratch-resistant coating. And I think it's important to stress just how thin this watch is, as for me it's one of its more impressive aspects. When I first got it, it actually reminded me of another watch I used to have, and that was the Traska Summiteer, which isn't really surprising because it's another Explorer-like watch. Overall, the Summiteer is a good watch with a really sleek case, But eventually I sold it. After a while, I felt that the design just felt a little flat and wound up being a bit boring. At the time, I thought it was just a trade-off for having such a thin watch, as there's only so much you can do with the space you have. But here, the Triumph, it actually proves that's not always the case, because the dial here is still interesting and engaging with a surprising amount of depth for a watch that's just over 9mm. With this particular colorway, it all starts off with this gray sunburst dial, which is then paired with white accents. At the very edge of the dial, there's a detailed chapter ring, which is interrupted by the indices, the majority of which are simply painted on, with smaller Arabics just inside of that. And granted, that doesn't really sound all that interesting. But at the cardinal points, the 12, the 3, the 9, things change. The indices are applied thick sloped wedges that are then framed with a polished metallic edge, all of which is then filled with copious amounts of BGW9 LUME. In some ways, the overall layout is simplistic and a call out to the classic field watches of old. Yet that very minor change at the cardinal points changes things drastically. It not only introduces a potent crosshair effect, centering your eyes right at the dial, but it also introduces additional textures, geometry, and layers, which perfectly pair with the beautiful diamond-cut sword hands, which also have a slight angled edge to them as well. And all of that just drastically adds to the visual complexity compared to a simple traditional field watch. Yet at the same time, it's still very familiar and easy to read as it should be. Although, again, the depth of the design is especially important here, at least to me, because it's one of the major elements that I love. That it doesn't appear flat like that Summit here did. And some of that depth is a bit of an illusion. The applied indices are obviously much taller than the painted ones. Yet the angled outer edge also has cutouts, but not just for where it's needed with those larger applied ones, but also the painted indices. And that little notch just seems to create an illusion that they're not quite as flat as they actually are. Although as good as I think this design is, I still have one major critique, and that's with the date down at the 6th. I love the framing around it, especially because that just adds to the whole depth. But a white date wheel and a white date wheel at this price? I mean, come on, it just looks out of place here. A color match date wheel is obviously the way to go here. Overall though, it's a fantastic, unusual design that's beautifully executed. Just like the case, the dial is not only functional, but one with touches of sophisticated refinement. Which is why I think this watch is often thrown out as a comparison or an alternative to the Explorer, as it fills that similar role, a true go anywhere and do anything kind of watch. Although where the Explorer has this serene sense of beauty in its cleaner dial, the Triumph is definitely a bit more complex, and that may throw some. Which is why maybe a Rolex Air King would be a more apt comparison. Either way though, I think it still fills that same role, creating a very versatile watch, and that's really one of the reasons I became obsessed with it, as I wanted something that filled that same Explorer-like niche, yet I wanted something a bit different. I wanted an alternative that wasn't clearly a copy or an homage. Something interesting that could easily stand on its own, and that's exactly what the Triumph is. And one quick side note before we jump to the LUME, if you're someone that likes the more cleaner, simpler look of, say, the Explorer, you're probably thinking this one is a bit too chaotic. I know I like the complexity, but I know not everyone else does. And if that's the case, and you like everything else about this but that, then you might want to check out one of Monta's other watches, the Noble, which I just happen to be borrowing right now. I'll have a review out sometime next month, but it has a similar case to the Triumph, yet it's done more like a dress watch, or maybe like a Aquaterra-ish kind of thing. Anyway, as for the LUME here is good, which was a nice surprise, although at this price, maybe it shouldn't have been. But I've seen plenty of other watches where as long as it's not a dive watch, LUME is just an afterthought to the brand. They just don't care about it. So it's good to see that Monta is making sure that this is the complete package. For this, they went with a simple BGW9 setup. but it is rather cool and has a distinct profile to it, with the larger cardinal points as its highlight, as well as those larger applied indices clearly outlasted the painted ones, keeping that unique look going on. And as a whole, it is able to keep up with the Seiko Diver, which for a field watch is great. As for the movement, it reportedly uses Monta's own M22, which is really not their own. It's basically a Sellita SW300 that's made for them. Now, I'm not sure what grade they're using or if they're doing anything extra beyond just a stock SW300. But Justin, one of Monta's partners, did mention to me that the movements are inspected by their in-house watchmaker, just to make sure they're within a plus or minus 7 seconds a day average over 5 different positions before ever being sent out, which is nice and not something every company does. Now personally, I would love to see them utilize like a LJP G100 some point in the future. It's still Swiss made, still has that 28800 smooth sweep, but it also comes with an extended power reserve. However, that said, there's nothing wrong with a Sellita here. It's a great movement, and honestly, perhaps a more acceptable or proper choice when you're talking about a Swiss-made powerhouse, as LJP is still ultimately owned by Miyota. But anyways, this is perfect, but I'd still love to see them use it at some point. As for the bracelet, well, not counting the wear marks that came with mine, the bracelet is simply fantastic. It is easily the best microbrand bracelet I've seen, and also one of the best I've ever seen, period. It's an oyster-like bracelet with solid female end links, solid links secured with screws, and a good milled clasp. But honestly, that's the part you would expect. What you don't expect is just how well made it is. Its finish has this incredibly smooth satin feel to it. The fully articulating links easily conform to your wrist, and that's combined with an extremely comfortable taper as it heads to the clasp. Plus, there's a good fit to the end links as well. It's definitely not an innovative design by any means, but it is one that is perfectly executed. So again, one of the best bracelets I've ever seen. And if you know anything about Monta's history, that may not be surprising, as Monta kind of spun out of Everest bands, who have become known for making really high-end aftermarket fitted rubber and leather straps for Rolexes, as well as a few other luxury watches. So their customers are pretty demanding, and that's something they've kept up with Monta. Also, as I mentioned before, this is the older generation clasp. The newer generation, one that's on the Noble, has shifted to an on-the-fly adjustment system, as well as maybe a few other minor upgrades. This one's still good, but that may be one of the few things that I wish this bracelet had. That and maybe quick adjust end links, just to make things easier when you're traveling and want to swap to a strap. So amazing watch, definitely a keeper for me, and overall I'm very happy with this Grail. However, if there's one sticking point when it comes to Monta, and not just the Triumph but Monta in general, it's going to be the price. They are one of the higher end microbrands out there, and they charge accordingly. MSRP for this is $1,700, and I believe the Triumph is actually their cheapest model. So that Monta logo on the dial does come with a bit of a price tag. And that's not to say this is a problem because I don't think this is worth it. I actually do. I'm extremely happy with this one for what I paid for it, but knowing what I know now about it, if I hadn't have found such a good deal for this one, I still would have felt confident buying one new. Partly because I love the original design, partly because I appreciate the versatility, but mostly because I think the quality is here to justify that. Now, I can't say that this is a watch that is reaching luxury levels of quality, and mostly because I'm just not experienced enough with luxury watches to be able to make that call. However, I can say that compared to other watches I've seen in this price range, that Monta is punching above their weight class. And in that way, it kind of reminds me of Christopher Ward, just on a higher price point. Although the way Christopher Ward is going lately, that may not be true next year. Anyway, the problem here is more that there is a lot of competition, and more importantly, well-known name brand competition at this price point. Ones you can actually go see in person at a dealer, whereas with the Monta, you can't. And if you've never seen one before, then $1,700 is a pretty big leap of faith into the unknown. And that alone puts them at a huge disadvantage. So if at some point you're interested in the Triumph, you're interested in the Noble, or something that Monta has, then I highly suggest you try to go to one of the watch fairs that they attend, just to see one in person before buying it. Or maybe a local meetup if you know someone that has one. Which I know isn't always possible or easy. But another alternative is you could do what I did here and buy one secondhand. And the main reason I did that is even though after watching all of the different reviews, I just wasn't sure I believed in it. But I still wanted to check one out, and eventually I came across what I thought was a pretty good deal and just jumped on it. Which once again is a similar story to Christopher Ward, at least for myself. I kept hearing about how great they were for the price, and when I finally took a chance on it, I got it. I realized the Kool-Aid really was that good. And I think that's true here as well. So if you want to try the Kool-Aid, I think you know where to go to find it. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. As usual, let me know what you think about this one. I love it, and ever since I've got it, it's been a cornerstone in my collection. But let me know what you think, or just what do you think about Monta in general? Even as good as they sound, is it something you'd be willing to take a risk on, or would you rather go a more known route? Let me know down below, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.